Buenas noches, Santa Fe. Welcome to the closing night of the 2025 Santa Fe International Literary Festival. Needless to say, this promises to be an evening to remember as we wrap up our weekend with someone who has become, for so many of us, the chief interpreter of our chaotic political landscape, the one and only Heather Cox Richardson. Yeah. We, all of us, hope that together we've delivered on this festival's promise and that this weekend has left you inspired. For 3 days, we've come together to celebrate the power of story. At a time of unprecedented division, corruption, cruelty, the daily challenges to the rule of law, both here in the United States and beyond, our hope is that this festival and the community it represents, right here in New Mexico and around the world, can be one of countless centers of resistance, or what Terry Tempest Williams beautifully called this afternoon, sacred rage. Yeah. Where truth, values, community, and a little thing like the Constitution truly matter. And where our shared humanity is celebrated, and where the power of story can fuel empathy, compassion, and common decency where it's needed most. With that in mind, we're excited to announce the dates for the 2026 festival. May 15th, 16th, and 17th of next year, as well as a few of our featured authors, Isabel Wilkerson, Carl Hiaasen, James McBride, Liz Moore, Colm Toibin, and Jason DeLeon. A complete lineup of authors will be announced in the coming months. For many of us, the arrival of Heather Cox Richardson's newsletter in our inboxes each night is a signal that we've survived another day, and that she's here to help us make sense of it. Heather's reach is far and wide, but in case there are a few of you who don't know the broad outline for her story, here it is. A professor of 19th century American history at Boston College, Heather began writing synopses of events associated with the first Trump impeachment in 2029. Her reports became a daily Substack newsletter called Letters from an American, which readers immediately embraced as a way to get through the chaos and uncertainty of the COVID-19 pandemic. The newsletter was a breakout success. It was hailed for its clarity, insight, and straightforward style. And it quickly made Heather the #1 author on Substack. She currently has about 2.5 million subscribers to Substack and another 2.5 million followers on Facebook. For so many years, her missives are either the last thing we read every night or the first thing we read in the morning. How she pulls this off day after day, year after year, really defies belief. Heather writes about history in a way intended to leave readers feeling, in her words, smarter, not dumber. She breaks down the day's news within the context of American history, reminding us that major events, both good and bad, have precedence. Depending on one's mood and level of anxiety, this can either be a comfort, we've been down this road before, or frustration. Why in the world do we keep making the same mistakes? Increasingly, however, things have been happening that have no precedent, which is why Heather's wise analysis is more essential than ever. Best known for Letters from an American, Heather is also the author of 7 acclaimed books that chronicle the ups and downs of our nearly 250-year-old democratic experiment, and which foreshadow, to varying degrees, our current political situation. The titles alone tell the tale. For example, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. Wounded Knee, Party Politics and the Road to an American Massacre, and many more. Heather's most recent book is last fall's New York Times bestseller, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America, which traces political extremism from the founders to Donald Trump and celebrates the progressive achievements that have kept authoritarianism at bay, at least for the moment. The Guardian called it, quote, an excellent primer for anyone who needs the important facts of the last 150 years of American history and how they got us to the sorry place we inhabit today. A true citizen's historian, Heather has won the Authors Guild Baldacci Award for Literary Activism, the Francis Perkins Center's Intelligence and Courage Award, and the Ruth Ratner Miller Memorial Award for Excellence in American History. The arch-druid of political commentators, the great Bill Moyers, described her best when he said that Heather was, quote, that third eye for seemingly invisible threads that connect one moment to another, one event to another, one person to another person. We are so fortunate to have Heather and her third eye with us tonight to help us connect more dots. Heather will be joined on stage by someone else who's helped us make sense of the world, Kathleen McCleery. As those of you who saw her marvelous conversation with the great Amy Tan yesterday morning, Kathleen is an award-winning broadcast journalist who has worked for NBC and PBS, where she served as deputy executive producer of the PBS NewsHour. Since moving to New Mexico, she has reported and produced stories for that program on a wide range of topics, including politics, the environment, education, science, healthcare, and the arts. Kathleen taught journalism at her alma mater, Princeton University, in both 2016 and 2018, focusing on the media coverage of the U.S. elections. As a student at Princeton, she was the first female news director of the local public radio affiliate, WPRB-FM. Now let's give a big warm welcome to Heather and Kathleen.
Wow. I'm pretty sure that's for you.
It's for both of us, for sure.
A couple of things before we get started. One is that we will, of course, have time for Q&A. And Heather's even asked for a little more time than we've had in other sessions, so get your questions ready. But we want real questions, please no speeches. And we'll do that, almost at the end of our conversation. Mark said this is the first thing that many of us read in the morning, and sometimes the last thing we read at night. Here in Mountain Time, a lot of times we can read it at 11 o'clock at night, which is quite nice. So your insights really are very important to us, and the first thing I want to ask you is, will you give us a sneak preview of tonight?
So all I do is I take a look at what's happening in the news over the course of a day, and I see what people are talking about and the questions that people ask me. So in a way, you can probably guess what tonight is about. There's this big bill in front of Congress that the Republicans are calling the Big Beautiful Bill, that the Democrats have dubbed the Bad Billionaires Bill. And one of the things that's in it is the destruction of Medicaid. And the other big piece, of course, is the explosion of the debt thanks to the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. And so so far tonight is about what's in the bill, but also what I find really shocking is that since 1981, when we've talked about the problems with the deficit, and of course the deficit has come from the George W. Bush tax cuts and the Donald Trump tax cuts. The last time the Congressional Budget Office offered a projection of the future that showed the deficit going down because of increased revenues was in 2012, which was before the George W. Bush tax cuts became permanent. And one of the things that I just find mind-boggling in this period is that when we talk about dealing with the deficit and with so many of the things in our country that we would like to repair, we don't talk about taxes. And we are one of the under-taxed countries among advanced economies in the world. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the history of American taxation and where that came from. But, it's kind of a joke that every time I write early, which I did because of this tonight, something big happens. So who knows what it's going to end up being.
So no promises, but if you go to dinner, you can tell people what you heard tonight. This is a literary festival, so we're going to talk a little bit about your book. And the title, of course, as Mark said, is Democracy Awakening. We're 119 days into the Trump administration.
But who's counting?
And, and we have 1,343 to go.
Somebody's definitely counting.
Yes. So my question is, democracy, is it awakening? Is it sleeping? Is it dying?
Oh, come on, you know the answer to that, right? Look around you. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and a lot of Americans have figured that out, and they're stepping up to the plate to reclaim it. That's not for a minute to say that it's going to be easy, because it's not. But people who throw up their hands and say we're done seem to me to be abdicating their responsibility to make sure that we're not done, because we're not. And I am actually more hopeful now about the future of our democracy than I ever have been, because if you've been paying attention really now since the 1980s, but certainly since the George W. Bush administration, you saw this happening. And everybody would sort of sit there and say, oh, signing statements, you're cute, who cares? And now, of course, we're seeing why you care, and people are saying, hey, wait a minute, I care too. So I would say it's definitely awakening.
I think that's the best news I've heard all day. I'm a journalist, so I want to take you to some of the breaking news we've had this week. And
Isn't it astonishing? Like, the breaking news we've had this week would have been enough to break any administration before it, and would have been
right.
the defining issue of that administration. And sometimes we get those 3 and 4 a day. No wonder we're all exhausted, huh?
It's a fire hose. It's a fire hose of news. I want to start with corruption. Donald Trump took a trip to Saudi Arabia. We heard about cryptocurrency deals. We heard about a free Qatari airplane, the Palace in the Sky. The New Republic had a headline in an article this week, and the headline was, America has never seen a president this corrupt. Is it true?
Oh, yeah. And, we were talking about this before, and what's interesting is that presidents are rarely corrupt. The people around them are corrupt. They're power hungry, but they rarely earn it for the cash. And what we have under President Donald Trump is a presidency that is designed to deliver the wealth of the American Republic into the hands of a very few people, starting with the Trump family. And there's a difference between wealth and cash. Wealth is what makes life worth living. It's the schools, it's the hospitals, it's the scientific research, it's the roads, it's the beautiful spaces. Cash is something that you can keep in an account, that you can, buy a yacht with or something, but not something that is wealth for a society. And what we're seeing is the translation of American wealth into cash to put in the hands of a very few people. And this is the first time we have seen that in an administration. Now, what's interesting about this one and corruption is we have the obvious corruption like the airplane, which, by the way, it appears the Qataris tried to give away and nobody wanted. So they, this is kind of like, hey, we're going to get it out of here. And of course, Trump wants it because if it goes to the Air Force, they're going to have to do all the repairs on it before he takes control of it after he leaves office. So it looks like a twofer for him. That's the obvious stuff. But there are 2 less obvious things that have me deeply, deeply, deeply concerned. The first is AI, because it seems ever clearer to me every single day that Elon Musk never cared about saving money or anything. He wanted our data. And he has gotten our data to inform his AI because he wanted a leg up over Sam Altman, who had another version of AI. Now, if you were watching, you saw that all these AI dudes and a few women went over to Saudi Arabia with Donald Trump last week because Saudi Arabia is facing the loss of their huge revenues from their oil industry. So they're one of the world's heaviest investors in AI. And of course, they wanted that AI money. Now, if you look at all these deals that Trump insists he's bringing to the United States, they are all to build these mega centers to power AI. This is why we're going to need all of a sudden so much more energy in the world, although China has developed AI that takes a lot less energy. But if you look at what that's done to Memphis, for example, you look at how that's going to really, really hurt the country. And I really worry that people are not paying enough attention to that. One of the things that's in the bad billionaires bill is an attempt to stop states from regulating AI for 10 years. Which is, you're going to hear about that in tonight's letter too, which honestly, when I read about it, I thought, oh no, they wouldn't have done that. That's just too obvious. But it turns out it really is in there. So that worries me a lot, but the other thing that worries me a lot is cyber currency, cryptocurrency. the level of corruption involved in cryptocurrency is unimaginable to those of us who are not playing in it. And that is where Trump is really, really pulling down the big bucks. And I just feel like people aren't paying attention to that at all. So this is very new. We just got to convince a lot of people that it's happening because it's so out in the open. I think people think he couldn't really be taking $2 billion from the UAE, could he? And the answer is, yeah, he could.
Yeah. You mentioned wealth and AI, and I've had friends say to me, "Why? I just don't get it. Why is it that Donald Trump succeeds in," and their words were, bullying the rich and powerful to support him? It sounds like you're saying the answer is the wealth, the currency.
Well, that's actually a really interesting question because it's not just the wealth. Because one of the things that's worth remembering is that the Republican Party is profoundly divided and in a war for control over that party. And what Trump could always deliver was voters. He could deliver the MAGA voters who were much more likely to turn out to vote than Republicans who were not MAGA. And certainly the independents would turn out for Republicans. So the reason originally that the Republicans in 2016 kowtowed to Trump was because he could deliver those voters. That's no longer obviously the case. Have you noticed this? You had Mike Pence out there today speaking up against Trump. Mike Pence over the weekend apparently discovered the Emoluments Clause. Who knew, right? And I forget who said this to him. Maybe it was Kristen Welker said to him, because he said, tariffs are paid by the consumer or something like that. And she goes, did you mention this to Donald Trump in his first term? And he goes, well, yeah, but it's the president, the president can decide that. And she goes, are you sure you said it to him? And he said something like, well, yeah, in the hall or something. I'm like, way to go, courageous Mike. But you can already see that the only place where Trump is not underwater, and there he is running even, is with rural MAGA voters. Rural Republican voters, not necessarily MAGA, and there he's running even. So 45, 10% say they have no idea what's going on. What that says is that those voters are no longer going to swing an election. So all of a sudden, you're watching Republicans who are not MAGA jockeying to get into position in the future without MAGA voters. And so you're seeing Ted Cruz, for example, Josh Hawley. Who's the other one who stepped up the other day that I'm drawing a blank on now? Them trying to distance themselves from Trump.
Well, Tillis did, right?
Oh, yeah, Tillis has another issue in North Carolina. But yeah, so there's also that fight within the Republican Party. But what makes this so interesting is those MAGA voters have not shown an allegiance to anybody else, not Carrie Lake, did you just see that Marjorie Taylor Greene decided she couldn't run in North Carolina? For Senate. I mean, for Senate, she's safe up there in her House seat, but she's not going to run for Senate. So one of the things to be watching going forward is those Republicans. They're not going to break, but those Republicans to see what issues they wiggle on, because those MAGAs are no longer cemented to the Republican Party. And this is one of the reasons that you keep seeing Republicans nod at the idea that Trump will run for a third term. Here's a newsflash: dude is not running for a third term. There's a Big Mac with his name on it somewhere. But they want people to think that they should turn out for him or for his chosen successor. Now, who's the chosen successor? Do you think anybody's going to turn out for J.D. Vance? Don Jr., you think about that, but again, Don Jr., that's a hard sell. I mean, think about it. Who's the MAGA heir apparent? Ivanka is an issue. However, she's not visible right now. So, and then there's the younger one. But the point here is in the short term, there's really nobody to pick up those voters who the Republicans were so desperate to garner in 2016 and in 2024.
Well, on the voters, there was a new New York Times Siena College poll in the New York Times today which said that voters are more likely to support Trump if they are not following the news. Yeah. The quote was, President Trump's strategy to flood the zone may be working to keep his approval rating from sinking even lower. So I want to talk about that strategy to flood the zone.
Did you just hear that yourself? Keep it from sinking even lower. All these people who say to me, like, he's unstoppable. He's underwater in every single demographic.
But talk about this strategy, because you wrote about it this week, right? You wrote about something called narrative warfare. What is it, and how worried do we need to be?
Well, there's two things. There's the narrative warfare that is taking place right now under the Comms Department in the White House. So you must have noticed this. The Comms Department has become a rapid response. We must command the news every single day with videos, with photographs, with outrageous things. So, for example, in the last 2 days, we have seen Trump first releasing a very not doctored, but very clipped audio version of Joe Biden responding to the questions about from Robert Hur about his the files that they found in his garage. And we'd already seen the transcript, but they released the audio. And they released a very short portion of the audio, which is when he was hesitant about his son's death. That audio is quite long. He's on top of a lot of things to the point where somebody says he has photographic recall and so on. But they dropped that little bit. Think about when they dropped it. They dropped it right after Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating. It was like clockwork. Similarly, after he went after Bruce Springsteen and Taylor Swift, which got a ton of headlines, he released an AI version of him doing Don't Stop Believin' by Bon Jovi. And clearly you have not poisoned your minds with this. I have now seen Donald Trump in a blue silk jumpsuit. Or at least the AI version.
Where did you see that?
It's online. I'm not urging you to go see it. It's exactly what you think it's going to look like. But the idea is to command headlines so that people don't give oxygen to the things that really matter. And as he tries to get this bill through, we're going to see so much crap. We're just going to see, and the Bon Jovi was right up there, just saying. But there's something bigger that has been polluting, I think, democratic governments since at least the 1990s. And I think we could even argue in the United States that it goes back further, all the way to the Nixon administration, when you had people deliberately manipulating the media to create something that is not true. So if you remember, under the Nixon administration, he had a whole team of people who were self-proclaimed dirty tricksters, who were engaged in something they called rat stuff. And what they would do is they would write letters to newspapers purporting to be supporters of Nixon or attackers of Nixon's opponent, or they would hire people to cater a Democratic event and then they wouldn't pay the bills and so on. Well, I'm arguing that starts under Nixon, but it really takes off actually under two of Nixon's operatives, Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, who become political operatives who work in the former Soviet republics, especially after the fall of after Reagan takes office, but then after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And what they do is they begin to develop the idea of creating a false reality for people so that you can convince voters to vote away their democracy. And the way you do that is they have 5 techniques, which I think is really interesting, because top on the list, and we never talk about it in the United States, is blackmail. That's what they start with in the manuals. There's a number of books on this, by the way. But then there are other ways as well. You can run a candidate who has the same name as another candidate of your opponent so that the vote gets split. You know, 2 people have gone to prison for that in Florida recently. Or you run somebody who has a very recognizable name who doesn't actually embrace the principles of that very recognizable name. No idea who that might sound like. But the 2 that are important for this idea are the idea of gaslighting. You flood the zone with untruths so that people think things are true that are not. But even more than that, the idea, and think about this makes total sense in the post-Soviet republics. People didn't want to have limits on how much information they could get. That smacked to them of communism, and they didn't like that at all. The opposite of that is flooding the zone with so much crap, you stop being able to make any sense out of it. And people either say, well, they're all liars, and they're all corrupt, and I don't care, it doesn't matter who I vote for. Or they say, I just can't tell anymore, and they back away. And in both of those cases, what you have done is you've opened up the world, opened up that realm for people to stop participating in their government and to give way to a strong man. And that seems very much to imitate what we have seen in the United States since at least 2015. We know the Russians were involved in the 2016 election, along with things like Cambridge Analytica. And one of the reasons I'm beside myself over Elon Musk having so much of our data is because if you think they had data on us in 2016, imagine what they're going to have in 2026.
Exactly. I think that this is a real challenge for news organizations, especially news organizations that don't have huge staffs and lots of money. I'm thinking about the NewsHour and my friends there. But I wonder what you think about how ordinary people and journalists can cope with all of this, with not just the fire hose of information, but also with the disinformation, and I'm using that word very specifically. Misinformation can be inadvertent, and it can be corrected, and often is. Disinformation is what you just said, deliberate and disseminated. So how does the ordinary person or the ordinary journalist deal with all of that?
To me, those are 2 separate questions.
Okay.
Because journalists know what the real stories are. And they're, I mean, to me, I don't really care about Donald Trump showing an AI doctored version of him singing Don't Stop Believing. I mean, that's not going to change the fate of the universe. A bill that will be the most massive transfer of wealth from the middle class and the poor to the wealthy in America, that's the story. Now, the issue with that is that bill is more than 1,000 pages long. And it's hard to do. It's hard to read through. It's hard to figure out. It's still going through markup and so on and so forth. Journalists should know that, and they should be able to make that decision. Now, that being said, one of my huge frustrations during the Biden administration was that it felt to me like the journalists in the mainstream media especially fell for the bells and whistles every freaking time. And the stories were there, and they just weren't getting covered. And now you can see that really taking off in independent media, which is simply fabulous. If you are not following 404 Media or Wired, I subscribe to Wired. You know, I would never have subscribed to Wired 4 years ago. Or any of the many independent people out there, they're doing really terrific work. So the stories are there. Now what people can do who are not involved in journalism, I think, is stop reacting to the crap. Recognize it's there, see it, and dismiss it, or else make fun of it the way people have done to 8647, which is everywhere now, which was the only way to handle that. And I'm sorry, for those of you who weren't paying attention,
I think they all read your letter. I'm pretty sure.
And so stop, and then also just to make sure you don't share crap, and that you call out crap when you see it, because there's a lot of stuff out there. There was something I was going to write about yesterday, and it just didn't feel right. Well, here we go. This isn't what I was going to write about, but you saw yesterday there was a horrific bombing of a reproductive health care center. And lots of people went out there instantly and said, this is terrorism, we knew this was coming, and so on. And it appears now, anyway, it's still a little bit too early to tell, to my mind, it appears that it was not politically motivated, except in the sense that this young man had some very serious ties to sort of a nihilistic cult. And that's one of those things where it was just so easy to say, well, this is all about the right wing, when it sounds like it was really about what was going on inside his head. So waiting a little bit. You know, I used to teach at MIT, and they always used to say to us, don't react. If somebody calls you and says you have to answer this query immediately, or you're going to lose your bank account, or you're going to do this, or we're going to shut down your computer, or whatever, never do it. Because anybody who says you have to do it instantly, or something bad is going to happen, they're trying to hurt you. And that seems to me to be a good rule of thumb for the news as well.
Good, take a breath. Yeah. I want to turn to writing, because everybody in this audience is either a writer, a reader, or both. And I want you to tell us a little bit about, I'm going to use the wrong word, how you spit out a letter every day. Because I think the verb is wrong, because I suspect that what you do is not as effortless as it looks to us when we spend 5 minutes reading it. So tell us about the craft of writing the letters from an American.
Thank you for that, because I try and make it look effortless, and it takes every waking moment I've got.
Can you give us an example of one that was difficult to craft?
The hardest ones are the ones where I've got what I would call B- stories, 12 B- stories. Because one of the things that I try and do is I try and craft the day's news into a memorable story. So one of the things people complain to me about a lot is that I haven't covered something big. And my answer is always, I covered something else big. And you know, as a writer, if you have two big things, they cancel each other out. So you have to have one day and one the next day. If you have 13 things that are kind of meh, it's very hard to turn that into, here's a good story. And I did that a couple nights ago when, and now I can't remember, it started out being about disinformation, and then I went into, here's what the disinformation was about. And those were like 35 medium stories. That took forever. That's when I was flying out here, by the way. We got delayed, so it was extra long. Those are the hardest, but there is increasing craftsmanship, I think, going into them.
Yeah.
And that's very deliberate. Some of them, I think, stand up very well. I think you might be referring to the one that I wrote.
Well, my favorite was the one that started with the Magna Carta and King John, and then it went to Bruce Springsteen.
So I'd been wanting to write about the Magna Carta for a while, and I knew that there was a copy in the United States, which is why I wanted to write about it. Like, why do we have a copy of the Magna Carta? Because it was like a little bit before the United States got going, right? So I happened to, you know, it's funny, I was Googling it one night, and I started reading without seeing who the name was. And it was David Rubenstein talking about how he was on a plane coming to America, and he happened to get a call, but I didn't know who it was, and I thought it was a journalist. He happened to get a call that they were selling a Magna Carta, and he thought, well, you know, I've never been to an auction, that would be cool to sit in on. I'm totally thinking it's a journalist. And he goes, see, you know, they put me in a room, and I'm on a phone, I'm listening to all these guys talking, and, you know, it was just amazing, I bought it. And I'm thinking, which journalist is this? And then, of course, I figured out who it was. But I thought that was a really cool story, because he said, I wanted it to stay in America. And then when they found a Magna Carta.
At Harvard?
Imagine? Can you imagine? I mean, that to me, that's like my dream. I mean, not that I'd find something else, but so then I wanted to really research what it was about, but I'm not a British scholar. I mean, I spent a lot of time doing that research so that I didn't screw it up. And apparently I didn't, because I actually got a letter from a British scholar saying, wow, we're so glad an American didn't screw that up. But then, like, where do you end it? Like, okay, that was the Magna Carta, and they found it. Cool. And then I'm like, where am I going to end this? And I'm scrolling through, because it's late by then, I'm scrolling through social media, and my boy Bruce gave me my final quote. It was just, I was like, dude, yes, getting this from there to there.
Okay, so you just said you do a lot of research. I think some of us think you must have a staff of dozens, hundreds, I don't know, people behind you.
People send me tips, and I'm very, very happy to have them. But no, it's me. It's
That's just amazing.
Well, so I should clarify. The research is entirely me, with the tips that I get from people. But before that, first of all, remember, I know American history really well. I've been at this a long time, so I know where to look. So even last night, for example, I knew there was new scholarship on Black Americans in the South using civil law. I knew that because my friend Dylan Penningroth just wrote a great book on it. So I looked up Dylan's work. He referenced that other journal article that came out last year, so I could read the journal article, and then I was good to go, right? So I know where to look. So the history part isn't the hard part. The other stuff, honestly, in a way, it's kind of like, I assume, watching a soap opera would be. Like, you know your characters, and you kind of know what they're going to do, so you know where to look, and you know where the big stories are. People always tell me I should take a week off, and I'm like, that would be so much work, because then my characters will all have changed. It's easier for me to stay. So you know this. If I take a night off with a photograph, I've got to do double the work the next night. So it's less impressive than you think. Let me just be clear, though. When I say the research is all me and the writing is all me, I do have one ace in the hole that nobody else in the world has, and that is the best copy editor ever conceived by the universe. And she has been with me probably for 5 years. She reads everything I put on Substack or Facebook, even to the point earlier this year she had surgery. And I said to her, I don't care, I'm not sending you the letter tonight. And she said, please, as soon as the anesthetic wears off, I'll read it. And she did. And she's also a fact checker. And that's why I almost never make a mistake. No. She makes sure I don't make mistakes. So that's a great advantage.
I think it sounds like there could be a job opening, though. All right, the question that I got most when I told people that I was going to meet you and talk with you, and I'm going to quote my daughter because she asked it, which was, please ask her if she sleeps and is it at night?
So I don't sleep as much as I should. I'll be honest, you know what the real problem is? I think I probably get enough sleep, but the problem is it's no longer in a bed like normal people. I do hit the bed for at least 4 hours. 6 is enough. I fall asleep a lot at my desk. The hard part of this is that I neither sleep nor eat at normal times anymore. I'm kind of like a newborn. But I used to be able to drive a lot, and I never fell asleep driving, and I now will not agree to drive any longer than an hour and a half without being able to stop and take a nap, because it's just not safe.
Good
idea.
I know that. I want to come back to the book for a minute, because there was one passage that really stuck out for me, and I think it'll give us a chance to talk about a little what's happening now and a little bit more history. And it starts in 2017 with the first inauguration of Donald Trump, and then you take us back. So here you go. I did.
So the funny thing is, your technique changes as you change, and I have not actually looked at this book since I wrote it, and I bet I'm not going to like the way I wrote it. Do you know one of the things that I love about writing is many years ago, I was talking to quite a well-known writer, and somebody gave him an assignment, and he just sat down and started writing. I said, how the hell did you do that? I mean, you don't have an outline, what are you doing? And he looked at me like I was crazy, and he said, can't you hear the music? And I was like, what music? I don't hear any music. I can now hear the music. And I'm not sure the music is in this book. We'll have to see. Seriously, if you listen to me read the letters, my poor sound guy, I'll be like, beat, beat, and then the next sentence. And he's like, okay. All right. That was some weird shit, former President George W. Bush remarked at the end of Trump's inaugural address. Trump's election to the White House signaled a sea change in American history. Since the 1950s, movement conservatives had called for destroying the active government of the liberal consensus. And since the 1980s, Republican politicians had hacked away at it, but had left much of the government intact. In 2016, the nation had finally, wittingly or not, put into office a president who would use his power to destroy it. Trump's agenda was not popular with the majority of American voters who had backed Hillary Clinton. It was not even popular with all Republicans. While Republican leaders had spread the false narrative of socialists taking over the country and suppressed votes to stay in power, they were more interested in establishing the kind of oligarchy that had run the country in the 1850s, 1890s, and 1920s than in dismantling the government. Republicans had been ramping up the rhetorical techniques of dividing the country and demonizing their opponents since the 1960s, but they did not want an apocalypse. They wanted an end to business regulation and social services and the taxes they required. Trump had risen to the presidency thanks to their machinations, but he went far beyond them, making the leap from oligarchy to authoritarianism. Man, that holds up, doesn't it?
It was the beginning and then the end, the leap to authoritarianism that really struck me there. And the idea that this is, well, you tell me, he's not the first one to aspire to being an authoritarian or even to promote the idea of just a very, very strong leader. So take us back in history a little bit to other presidents, and if you will, this is a two-part question, sorry, to the memo that very young Samuel Alito wrote long before that, in 1986.
Trump's leap to authoritarianism, I think, is a really interesting one. So when I wrote, I think it was I should say, my manager is here, and she makes everything happen. And she would know which book it was, and I'm afraid I don't, so we ought to ask her. But when I wrote the final epilogue or something to a recent book, I realized that I was really good on Donald Trump's election and on the first thing he did, the travel ban and all that. And I was really good from like July 2019 onward. But I thought, what happened in between those two things? Like, think about it. Can you think of what he did in 2018? And I couldn't. And here's a news tip for you. Wikipedia actually has day-by-day events in a president's administration. So I went and started reading through it. And 2018 was the period when Trump kind of lost it. So if you think about the beginning of his first administration, he tried to be normal. He went to the Kennedy Center. He had a state dinner for Abe of Japan. You know, he was kind of going through the motions of being a president appealing to everybody. Everything changed dramatically in August of 2017 after the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville, when he's talked about there being good people on both sides. And when that happened, a number of dominoes started to fall, including the fact that he lost the goodwill of a number of people who were trying to work with him and turned against him. And he went into this period in which that's when he started to call himself the stable genius and so on. But what he did after that was he turned those people at the Unite the Right rally into his foot soldiers, and he doubled down on them. I think that was a really major turn for him, because he went from, hey, I'm the strong president of the United States, I'm going to pull the power of the United States behind me, and we're going to do this together, to being, I'm going to be a strong man who takes the power of the United States for myself. So there's a really interesting shift there, because he takes the rhetoric of the Republicans that they've been using since the 1980s at least, and he turns it into a movement. Because you can't have a movement unless you got foot soldiers. And he does that. It's a really interesting phenomenon there. The rhetoric that he picked up and the instruments that he picked up that enabled him to become the nominee in 2016 are what you're talking about, because the Republicans get taken, the traditional Republican Party, about which I've written a lot, is taken over in the 1980s by what the faction that calls itself movement conservatives.
Right.
A movement because they are a political movement, and conservatives because that's the name they give themselves, rather like the Fox News Channel calls itself a news channel, even though in its terms of service, in the second paragraph, it says that they are there for entertainment purposes only. They're conservatives only in the sense that they want to get back to the period before the New Deal. We could talk about that history. But they call themselves movement conservatives. And what they want to do is they want to get rid of taxation, they want to get rid of regulation. Those are their two major issues. And in order to do that, you've got to get rid of the social safety net, and they're also not keen on black rights or women's rights. That's another whole story. But they realized by 1986, by the midterms of 86, that they elect Reagan in 1980, takes office in 81, we get the first set of tax cuts. They realize he gets reelected in 84, although interestingly enough, well, never mind. 86, I know too much about the Republicans. 86, they recognize that they don't have the votes, that people don't like the cuts that they're making. So you see two really dramatic things happen in 1986. You see Edwin Meese, who is Reagan's Attorney General, talking about stacking the courts so that the Reagan Revolution can never be overturned, no matter what people want, what people vote for. And you see the beginnings of voter suppression. They begin to start talking about voter integrity, even though their memos, which came out during a lawsuit, say that they understand that what they're really doing is throwing black people out of the vote. You also see the real distrust of democracy. People don't know what's good for them. And so this young man who's in the Department of Justice at the time figures out a way to increase the power of the president. And the way he's going to do this is through these things called signing statements. Now, signing statements have always been around in the sense that, not always, George Washington didn't do this, but they've been around for a long time, where somebody, you know who did this in huge numbers is Lyndon Baines Johnson. So if you go to the LBJ library, there are whole walls of pens, because he would sign things and then he would give pens to the people who had helped to pass a measure. So they would make signing statements saying, thanks to John Smith and Jane Doe and all that for helping us get this bill through. Well, this young man decided that the president could use those signing statements to limit the ways in which that law would be enforced, rather like impoundment of money, but instead impoundment of principle. And the man who decided to do this with the idea of preserving the power of the president, or increasing the power of the president, recognized that Congress was going to go ballistic, because Congress gets to write the laws, and the president does not have the right to do that. So they figured they would start with something small that nobody would pay any attention to, and they did that on a very small bill. And they got it through, nobody paid a lot of attention to it. And they tried it on a little bit bigger bill, and this started in the Reagan administration. And of course, by the time we get to the George W. Bush administration, we see it used for torture, in which the Congress says you will not torture people as the American government, and George W. Bush says, I have the right to keep Americans safe no matter what it takes. Well, where you're going with, I think, this is that the young man in the Department of Justice who wrote that memo in the 1980s was named Samuel Alito. There's only 6 people in this administration, and they do the rest with mirrors. But you can see this, his dislike of democracy and his determination to make sure that the American people's voices are not heard started back then, and transferred to the idea of having those distress flags in 2020 and 2021, and now has him saying we don't have to pay any attention to due process.
which is, all right, so let's go from there. Lots of places we can go. But let's go to the rule of law. Because you wrote one of your letters from an American about a Time magazine interview that was done with Donald Trump recently. And the interviewer at the very end said, I understand there's a portrait here somewhere of John Adams. Do you want to take the story from there?
No, go ahead.
And he said...
First he said, which one is he?
That's right. Which means that he's not on...
Chubby little guy on the side there.
He's not on the design team for the interior of the White House. But maybe he didn't know which one was John Adams. We're not sure. But he then quoted...
I'm sorry, how can you sit in a... The Oval Office is not big. This is an old building. The rooms are really little. How can you sit in a room and not know who the portraits are?
I can't answer that question.
There's only 45 presidents, right? Because a couple went up twice. I'm sorry.
So then the interviewer quoted, he said, Mr. President, John Adams said, we're a government made by laws, right? And he asked if he believed in that, right? So there, you can take it from there.
Yes, and he said that maybe, except that was you weren't sure you had to do that because you had, as long as you had honest men like him in office or something like that. But there was more than that, because he went on another place and said we didn't have to have the rule of law because that sounded good, but that would mean we'd have to have millions of trials for undocumented immigrants. And then to add to that, not that I'm paying close attention to this or anything, when he had a journalist in the Oval, and he's got a copy of the Declaration of Independence on the wall. It's a copy, it's not the real one. I don't know why they've got it behind a thing. Maybe they told him it was the real one. And the journalist said, in fairness, sort of probably expecting that if you went to all the trouble to have it installed on your wall, you would know what it was. And he said, what does it mean to you? And he said, it's this great document of unity and friendship. It's important to all of us. And I lost at least 10 years off my life. How can you have no idea what's in the Declaration of Independence? The title says it all, right? Well, it's a great Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's like when they asked Richard Nixon what he thought of the Great Wall of China, and he said, I can truly say that this is a great wall.
But Heather, on those two examples, and you wrote about them in a very journalistic way, and you didn't make any comment at the end. And I'm wondering what those stories tell you about Donald Trump.
They say to me he doesn't value our democracy at all. That what he sees in this world is a zero-sum game of individuals getting the most goods. And I brought up the Declaration of Independence, not just because I get mad about it every day, but because he wanted the thing. He doesn't care about the principles. And without the principles, the Declaration of Independence is just a piece of paper. But he had to have the paper. And he doesn't understand the rule of law or why it's important. He doesn't understand why democracy is important. He doesn't understand that if everybody doesn't have rights, you don't have rights. He doesn't understand any of that. He just wants the most stuff, which strikes me on a personal level as being a symbol of such extraordinary poverty. But for a nation, it strikes me as being a complete overturning of everything we have ever stood for. So my role, I think, I don't care about Donald Trump at all. I think he's a really interesting figure in a lot of ways. But I want Americans to understand that it's not the goddamn piece of paper. It's the principles.
So sticking with the principles for just a moment, the right to vote. It's something that we assume everybody over 18 can vote. And yet we're beginning to see, or maybe we're not just beginning to see, that's the part you can add for us, ways in which we curtail where, when, how, and we're worried about who can vote. So give us a little bit of historical perspective, because you mentioned this earlier, voter suppression.
So if I read one more article about where did the black people go, why didn't they turn out to vote, without it looking at voter suppression, my head's going to explode. Because I mentioned the start of the attempt to suppress the vote in 1986. Now, you may or may not remember this, but so the Republicans start talking about it in 1986, although their memos, as I said, from this lawsuit, make it clear that they're intending to throw black people off the rolls. The Democrats turned that around in 1993 with the Motor Voter Act. After the Motor Voter Act, the Republicans begin to insist that Democrats are only winning elections with illegal voting, primarily immigrants. Immigrants sort of come from nowhere in that rhetoric in 1994. In that 94 election, there are two races, one in California and one in Louisiana, that the Republicans insist the Democrats only won by cheating. One's in the House and one's in the Senate. And they have a year-long investigation of those two elections. One is Feinstein, by the way. And it's Mary Landrieu, I think, in Louisiana. And at the end of the day, they say, well, first of all, they're out in front of the cameras every day talking about voter fraud. Every day, the cameras show up. And this is where we start to see Republicans really leveraging investigations to seed the idea of something without ever producing anything. So, of course, the repeated investigations of Hillary Clinton and Benghazi, for example, where quite literally Kevin McCarthy said, well, everybody had forgotten about it till I ran another investigation, right? So, in 94, at the end of the day, they say, well, we didn't find any evidence, but that's only because the Democrats hid it so well. Well, this language continues until 1998, 4 years later, 1998, when there's still talk about voter integrity in Congress, but it's actually Florida that goes ahead after an extraordinarily dirty Miami mayoral race, in which a Democrat was not running, by the way. It was an independent and Republican. Was very dirty, and lots of people went to jail. And Florida puts a voter suppression law into effect they voted in 1998, it goes into effect in 1999, knocks about 100,000 people in primarily Democratic areas off the rolls in Florida before the 2000 election. Yeah, you guys are going, ooh. Everybody's looking at those hanging chads, which did swing the election. At least that's what people have said most recently, the people who count this stuff. But 100,000 people were thrown off the rolls in Florida in 1999,
right,
between 98 and 99, for an election that came down, as you know, between Gore and George W. Bush in Florida to the tune of a couple hundred votes, a few hundred votes. Since then, that voter suppression has continued, and of course, if you want to fast forward now, and you've seen it in a number of cases, you've seen it in there's this attempt to continue to suppress the vote, and they think that they're looking pretty good until Barack Obama gets elected. And once Barack Obama gets elected, we see a number of changes. In 2010, we get Citizens United, which opens up the floodgates for more corporate money into the political system. And then in 2013, we get Shelby v. Holder, which guts the Voting Rights Act. On the heels of Shelby v. Holder, the voter suppression laws poured in from the different states, and that really took off after the election of 2020, when in 2021, I think we had 34 new voter suppression laws put in place across the country. So when we talk about Republican states, I always say that we should be talking about voter suppression states. And the way you can tell if it's a voter suppression state, well, this is easy, actually. The way you can tell if it's a voter suppression state is your state taking away ballot boxes and taking away the hours in which people can vote? Because if that's the case, they're suppressing votes. And this would be, at the very least, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, and more states as well. So when we look at the future, unless we push back against this, we're looking at what we saw in the American South from about 1894 to about 1965. We had elections, just everybody knew who was going to win them. And that is absolutely the direction that we're going right now. That being said, people are pushing back on that in a lot of places. North Carolina has been a shining star, so has Michigan, where as soon as they got ungerrymandered maps, I'm sorry I didn't mention Operation Red Map in 2010, which really pushed gerrymandering by monopolizing the state legislatures around the country in that year. As soon as Michigan pushed back against gerrymandering with maps that, because of the demographics and where they're located in Michigan, was still a map that favored Republicans, the Democrats won a trifecta and have passed all sorts of popular legislation. We've had this fight in Wisconsin that looks like it might be, pushing back against gerrymandering thanks to the election of the judge who was just elected that Elon Musk said this was the fate of civilization. Did you see this? Elon Musk said this would determine the fate of civilization because the gerrymandering in Wisconsin gives the Republicans at least 2 extra seats in Congress, and of course, there goes their majority if those are fair again. So this is a place to be paying attention going forward.
I want to follow up on the pushback before we go to audience questions, because I think people want to know what they can do to ensure that our democracy continues to awaken. And there were 2 authors here who said things this weekend. Amy Tan's talked about how observing birds has helped her practice hopefulness, which allows her to engage in activism. And Jonathan Ives told us a story of Martin Luther King. He wrote his biography, and he said Martin Luther King never gave up hope, and his last words before he was shot were, "Okay, I will." And Jonathan essentially exhorted us to do the same. So my question to you is, what can we do?
Well, I'm going to start by saying the obvious. Participate in your government at the local level first. Lots of stuff goes on at the local level: school boards, town meetings, development meetings, all the sorts of things that most affect people's lives. At the state level, because a lot goes on at the state level where things really matter and you can make a huge difference there. Call the people I affectionately call Congress critters every single day and put pressure on different departments as well to do things. Right now, I am beside myself over the fact that the Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, has given control over our Interior Department to the Department of Government Efficiency. He has literally put someone from the Department of Government Efficiency in charge of that, and they are looking to sell off a number of our public lands. We should object to that. And by the way, there are a number of places now where the public can weigh in on things like Schedule F, which is getting rid of our civil service. I've done it myself. You should do the same. You can do it anonymously if you want. There's all the obvious things you can do. Now I'm going to go with the less obvious. The way we change the country, I believe, because I am an idealist, meaning I believe ideas change society, is to do exactly that, to change ideas. That means to speak out about things that are false and to speak up about things you care about. Make sure your voices are heard, because for so long I feel like we tried to be polite to the hateful people in our midst, and it is time to stop being polite to them. They are a minority. They are a minority and they do not wish us well. But now there's more to that. Part of it that I think perhaps Ms. Tan was picking up on was joy. You know, authoritarians can't take root in a population that is happy. And the way that you become happy is by making community, by finding friends, by standing up for things together, but also by doing what you do best. If it's art or if it's music or if it's writing, in my case, bring it. Bring the best you've got to offer. There is, I think, in that extraordinary joy, not only in the doing, but also in the hard work. It's okay to work hard. It's okay to stay up all night if you're writing, you know? It's okay to come to Santa Fe where you don't have any oxygen, can I just say?
And we have to thank you for powering through this.
It's okay to work hard. Working hard is a good thing because you produce something at the end of it. But I would also say, I hear every day how terrible it is that we're living through this time, that we got stuck with this. And I think all of us would not take this voluntarily. But at the same time that it is a huge burden, it is also an extraordinary privilege to get to be the people who get to put our oars in the water to save American democracy in this time. So I would urge you to recognize the extraordinary privilege of that, and to realize that we're doing it together, and we can do it together, so long as we keep doing the work and doing it with joy.
Yeah. Time for the audience, and I'm sure they have questions, and we can't see them, so somebody tell us where the first question is. There, the lights are going up. They'll tell us when they have a question from.
Hold the mic. Oh, thank you. Heather, we've got someone about halfway out on your right.
Okay.
Hi, thanks for being here and thanks for what you do. I have a New Mexico specific question about what's going on in our state with the federal government, specifically the active duty military taking over a part of the...
we have a problem because there's such an echo, I can't understand a word you're saying.
We're not hearing that question, so I'm not sure if it's the microphone is too close.
It's the echoing off the walls, I think.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Cool. So I have a New Mexico question about what we are seeing in our southern border with active duty troops from Fort Huachuca in Arizona making a part of New Mexico a federal military base, whereby people are not allowed to enter that zone, while simultaneously our National Guard is sending troops to Albuquerque to do who knows what with a police department that just got out from under observation by the Justice Department. And we're sending apparently a few thousand troops to Africa from the National Guard of New Mexico.
I'm sorry, can you give us your question, please?
So what are your thoughts on what's going on here in New Mexico, if you have any?
I'm going to go a little bit broader than that. There's two issues here, big issues here. One, I think, is the expenditure of money, in that this administration appears to be spending money like water. Which is not the right, that's a Maine expression because we have a lot of water. I know you have less.
No.
Sorry about that. And we know that the Department of Homeland Security is going to run through its budget in a wildly illegal way in 2 months before the end of the fiscal year. That seems to be worth speaking up about, that use of our money. But the other piece that you are referring to is, I think, very, very important, and I'm not sure we're paying enough attention to it. What we seem to be seeing, I'm hedging that, is the repurposing of a number of different forms of law enforcement in unusual ways against undocumented immigrants around the country, certainly here on the border as well. And it is concerning that the ways in which that interfaces with the attempts to circumvent the legal restrictions on treatment of persons in the United States. That is, I'm trying to be really careful here. That is, there are reasons to think that the administration is deliberately trying to repurpose our law enforcement officers, and we have many different kinds of law enforcement officers, ostensibly to address undocumented migrants, although you know that this administration is deporting fewer migrants every month than the Biden administration did. They're much more visible. This is our comms team again. With the idea of changing the relationship between our law enforcement officers and our legal system so that once it is in place for undocumented migrants, it can be used much more effectively for people who are either naturalized U.S. citizens or U.S. citizens, and this interfaces with birthright citizenship. So that's not the answer you expected, but it's something that I think we should be very alert to over the next months of the summer, especially.
Another question?
A little bit farther back from that last questioner.
One of the things that terrifies me about the orange evil toddler is that I didn't think that he could get any newer votes. I thought it was going to be the same old stale votes, and I didn't think there was any way he could win. He seems to have...
I'm sorry, we're not understanding it, and I think if you want to use the reference to the 3 words, one of our authors, we need to say, Phil, she hasn't been here all weekend.
There's just a terrible echo off this back wall.
The reference he was making was to 3 words that we know exactly what
I'll make my question really brief. The thing that terrifies me is how Trump is using comedy, especially the podcast network in Austin, Texas, with the Joe Rogan and all this to inspire young white men, especially as the new voters for the Republican Party. Is there precedent, and how can we fight it?
That's a great question. I will point out that he has lost Joe Rogan over the issue of immigration and the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which fascinates me. And I think I actually dug a bit into this because MAGA Republicans are upset about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which I did not see coming. And yes, they're very upset about it, and that's where he's lost a number of the, Joe Rogan especially, but a number of the others as well. And the more I thought about it, the more it came down to the idea that if you think about the demographic that tends to be most loyal to the MAGAs, this is not your mother's Republican Party. They're people who themselves are rural, overwhelmingly, and who have often had run-ins with the law themselves, and know that they have come out on the other side of that thanks to due process. And they recognize that they could be where Kilmar Abrego Garcia is. And I was talking to a woman who defends people in rural areas, and she went, "Oh my God, this is so true." She said, because, and this had never occurred to me, in urban areas, police officers are busy with major crimes. So if you've ever had something stolen in an urban area, or, they're like, you're cute. If you want to fill out if you want to fill something out over there, that's great. But, we got somebody over here who just lost a leg. We're not going to pay any attention to you. If you live in a rural area, the police are bored. And they're much more involved in smaller crimes. So a lot of people get involved in the police system there. Most people run into police officers through vehicle issues, but they're much more involved with the justice system in rural areas for petty crimes than they are in urban areas. So apparently this is hit really hard. I think that's really interesting. Your point, though, about the young men being radicalized is not only the Joe Rogans, it's also the evangelicals. Because what they are hearing, the numbers, I just was reading this a couple days ago, the numbers are of young men who are becoming religious is very high. And it appears that what they really like is the idea of the return of a patriarchy that guarantees them a job and control over the people around them. And the way that one combats that, I think, this is all just such a really interesting field. But the way one combats that is to develop a media ecosystem that rivals that of the radical right, and that's very much underway. And we'll see where that goes, but I'm not entirely sure that they are as wedded to that world as we tend to think. I think people want to believe that what they do matters, and that their votes and their relationships are important for something larger than themselves. And the radical right has given that to them. Remember when they stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they all kept talking about it being a second American Revolution. Remember Lauren Boebert talking about this is 1776, which by the way is still up on her Twitter feed, which I think is interesting. Mm-hmm. We can do that, except we've got the good guys on our side. And that's something that I think we should talk about more. They've got the Confederates and the Nazis. We've got, the founders and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln and Fannie Lou Hamer and the D-Day guys who fought at D-Day. And I think we ought to talk about that more, about those are the true values of America, and try and make people get behind that rather than that hatred side.
Interesting. Next question.
Heather, we've got a local public school teacher here on your left.
First of all, thank you for keeping us all sane during this time. I guess my question is pretty big in some ways, but I keep expecting society to stop, for us to say we're not going to work. This is enough, right? To really protest, not just carry our signs and march, but really have a movement. And I'm wondering what you think it's going to take to make that happen, and what your prediction of is when that's going to happen.
I hear a lot, and it frustrates me that people say, no one's doing anything. And we heard this a lot immediately after the election, when a number of people said, no one's out there protesting, I guess they're all burned out. And I'm thinking, I don't know about you all, but the day after the election, I was going to take 2 weeks. I was hoping to take more than a month off. I was going to sit on a beach and drink Mai Tais. And instead of going on vacation, I was on the phone the next day with 23,000 other people planning what we were going to do next. So what I would argue is that we were out there in 2016 because we didn't know what to do. Whereas in 2021 or 2020, well, I've lost the year now, 2024, I don't know, the last election, we have our networks. We know how to affect change. And if you look at what we have done just to slow down the things that this administration has done, we've forced Trump to pull back the idea of putting the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency claims to have made into law. He's delaying that now, possibly for as much as 2 years. We have made the first cuts we made them get rid of the first cuts to Medicaid. Now we're going to try and make him get rid of the second cuts to Medicaid. We've had a lot of effect on what the administration has tried to do. And of course, they haven't even tried to get anything through Congress yet because they can't agree amongst themselves. At the same time, as soon as in February of 2024, the Democratic attorneys general of the states came together to figure out they would oppose everything that could possibly come up. So if you've noticed, every time Trump's administration tries to do something, the ACLU did this too, by the way, there are lawsuits against it within a day. Those were previously written that they stepped up to write about, to do. But in terms of people turning out to protest, I think this is really interesting because what we're seeing is protests not only in the big cities, but also in red rural areas. And you're seeing them increased by things like Democrats holding town halls in Republican districts, which I think is freaking genius, and they should be doing it everywhere. And you're seeing the pushback of people like Cory Booker and of Senator Van Hollen, who went down to meet with Abrego Garcia. We are seeing pushback for sure, but something big hasn't happened yet, and that's that it hasn't gotten warm yet. The fact that sounds stupid, but it's freaking cold in Boston, right? So I think over the course of this summer, so here I'm going to make a prediction, which I don't usually do. I'm a prophet of the past, not the future. I've said to a lot of people, I'm really worried about this summer. And what I mean by that is, for all the many ways in which this administration is trying to cement its power, it's actually being stopped right and left. And as that happens, it seems to me we're seeing that administration becoming more and more frantic. Now, to me, it looks like Donald Trump is not in control. And in a way, it's almost more dangerous to me that he's not, because there are clearly three factions behind him. There's the tech bros who wanted the data and want to destroy the government because they don't want regulation. There's Russell Vogt at the Office of Management and Budget, who is central to Project 2025 and was working with Department of Government Efficiency, who wants to get rid of the federal government because he wants to create a theocracy. And then there is Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem, who are the ones who are in charge of the administration policies, and immigration policies. And I really don't think that Trump is aware of what they're doing. I mean, I don't think he objects to it, but a number of times he has said, well, I don't know, you'll have to ask them, and which itself is completely unacceptable, by the way. But they've got cover. They can do whatever they want, expecting that he will pardon them. And unlike him, people make the mistake of thinking that Trump has been given a free ride by the Supreme Court. He has not. That Trump versus U.S. decision of July 2024 was a complete overturning of, I thought it was earth-shattering. It's a complete overturning of our entire government because it put one man above the law. But it didn't put him alone in charge of it. It said, since we've never done this before, he's going to have to run this by the courts, meaning the Supreme Court. Trump's got at least that hedge on them. He can pardon them. He can pardon his underlings, and I think they're feeling like they can get away with anything they want. So I'm expecting that over the course of this summer, it's make or break time, that they're going to be ramping things up. And you can see this with the increasing attempt to get around court orders, to render people into other countries, not deport them, but to render them to other countries, to prisons in other countries, even though the courts have said you may not do that. I think we're going to see more and more of that over the course of this summer. At the same time, we're going to see more and more pushback against that. So when I say I'm worried about this summer, I think it's going to be a rough summer in a lot of different ways, but I think you're going to find that your people are in the streets. And I think we need to be there. We only need 3.5% of the population to turn up in the streets to overturn a regime. And we're already at almost 2%.
I wish we had time.
There's a question from, or I guess the last question is from the far left wall over here.
I'll hold it.
Thank you for all of your suggestions. I'm not a historian, but I know that the United States has had several big revolutions, like the suffragette movement, the civil rights movement, and it's changed the dynamics of affairs. It looks to me like the Electoral College is historically archaic. It's 250 years old, and it doesn't seem to really represent the entirety of the United States. We didn't have the internet and instant communication when the Electoral College was created. So we created these representatives. Do you see some radical idea that can change the way we vote, given the way we have so much voter suppression?
Yes. The Electoral College is really interesting. I always say that. There's living through history, which is way too interesting. And then there are historical problems, which as a historian I find interesting. So if you read the journals of the the guys who wrote the Constitution. What's it called? The Constitutional.
The founders.
What's it called? The Constitutional Convention. If you read the article, the journals of the Constitutional Convention, they spend a huge amount of time talking about the Electoral College. And the reason they created the Electoral College is fascinating. They were determined that it would be entirely independent of the government, because they were worried that an executive would be able to corrupt members of the government in order to make himself president. So if you've ever been a member of the college, you know that you can't hold office, you can't within a couple of years, they don't meet at the same place the government does, and so on and so forth. It was a lovely thought, but of course it was corrupted almost immediately by my friend and buddy Thomas Jefferson. One of the reasons I don't like Thomas Jefferson, by the way, is because he recognized that while the Electoral College was designed to be proportional, that if he could get Virginia, which they'd gamed the system so they had more Electoral College votes than anybody else did, if they all voted as a bloc, he would become president. And he recognizes this after 1896, and in fact, in 1800, he does become president thanks to that. And when that happens, all the other states say, well, crap, Tom, if you're going to do it, we got to do it too. And that's how we've ended up with a situation where every state, with the exception of Nebraska and Maine, and Nebraska almost changed that in 2020, is a winner-take-all system, which completely skews the way we vote. Also, I would argue that you're correct that we don't need the system that they had then, because things have changed so much now, and some of the things that have changed, of course, are because the people who developed the Electoral College had no way to foresee steel frame construction, for example, which comes in the 1870s and enables us to have cities. Until you have steel frame construction, you can't have cities with a whole bunch of people in them, because you can only build about 3 stories high before the walls get too thick at the bottom to support the upper stories. And they certainly didn't know about modern transportation, which also changes the way that people settle into urban areas. So they had no idea of what was coming. So to me, yeah, the Electoral College, if you don't want to get rid of the Electoral College, you can simply say, well, okay, let's let it go back to what it was originally supposed to be, which was proportional. James Madison said, to Thomas Jefferson, you have completely perverted this. We have to amend the Constitution so you can't do that. But then, of course, every president who won based on winner take all was like, let's not fix the Constitution this time. So it hasn't happened. But yes, I think the Electoral College is one of our many problems. But let me suggest this. Always in American history, when we come to a place where a few people have gamed the system, like we did in the 1850s when elite enslavers tried to take over the country in order to monopolize it and have control over the wealth and the power of the country, or in the 1890s when the robber barons tried to do the same thing, or in the 1920s when the executives tried to do the same thing. Every time that happened, Americans took a look at what was happening, and they turned to each other and they said, listen, we may not agree about immigration, we may not agree about internal improvements, we may not agree about finances, but by God, we can agree we don't want to lose a democracy in favor of an oligarchy. And in each time that they did that, they came together, and not only did they restore democracy, they restored a better democracy. And if you think about where we were on January 19th, 2020, right now it looks like it was really good. But in a lot of ways it wasn't. We had voter suppression. We had the problem with the fact that the Electoral College has recently a number of times given us presidents who were not supported by the majority. And that's a problem for the legitimacy of the government. If people don't feel they're represented by the government, they either tune out or they revolt, or they get suppressed by the government. We had the problem of wealth inequality in this country, which is deeply problematic. We had all these problems of voter suppression. We have the problems of women's rights. We have the problems of the fact that our country has really not kept pace with the modern world. Our infrastructure has fallen behind. Women's rights have fallen behind. Minority rights have fallen behind. So if we take this moment and we do reclaim it from the MAGA faction, which, by the way, only about 4% of Americans actually like Project 2025, 4%. If we really take it back from them, we don't have to go back to where we were on January 19th, 2024. We can, or 2025, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with dates today. We can rebuild this country however we want it, the same way that they did in the 1860s and the 1890s and the 1930s, and we can make it better than it has ever been before. And that's what we need to be focused on now, going forward into this hard summer.
Before we leave, we have spent an entire weekend around stories and storytelling. And I want to ask you to think about that in terms of building a better democracy. Can we use, and you alluded to this earlier, but can we use the power of history, what's happened in our past, the examples and insights you give us, and the power of writing to engage and connect us to make those changes that you're talking about?
You know, history is just the story of who our country is, the same way that the stories we tell about ourselves are the stories of who we are. How do you cultivate that story of who you are? We need to be accurate about how we see our American history, and it has not ever been pretty. But the history and the stories in our past, for all the ones that are about destruction and hatred, are corresponding ones about extraordinary courage and the willingness to work together to try and make things better for the most people. Those are our stories too, and those are the stories that represent our country at its best. And we are fortunate in that they were encapsulated in that document that Donald Trump doesn't understand, that says that we have a right to be treated equally before the law. We have a right to equal access to resources, and we have a right to consent to the government under which we live. And any time that Americans have expanded rights in this country, the way I wrote about last night, they have stood firm on those principles. Those are the same principles that people talked about when they fought in the Civil War, or when they fought at D-Day, or when they fought for the right to vote in Mississippi in 1964. And that story, the story of ordinary people working together to make sure that all of us have those rights, not just for the morality of it, but so that we have those rights too. That's who America has always been. That's our birthright. That's our story. And that will take us forward into a new future. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. And finally, for myself, I've been on the road since September 2023, and this is my last gig for a long time, and I'm going to write a new book. But I want you to know that I consider myself the luckiest person in the world to get to write those letters every night and keep the record for this country of how we're going to get through this moment. God, you guys need to import some oxygen. But I never forget that I get to do it because of you all. So thank you for that and for having me here.